mobility infrastructure and state aid. We look very much forward to your presentation, which will be followed by a discussion and the opportunity to pose questions. Thank you. The floor is yours, dear Stéphane.
Thank you. So, thank you. Let me first address a warm thanks to Thomas Jaeger and his team for this very kind and friendship invitation to speak in the framework of the cycle of conference in EU law at the Vienna University. I think it's a very great opportunity to favor relationship between the two branches of the FIDE, the Austrian branch of the FIDE and the French branch of the FIDE, and to share common analysis on current issue of EU law. From a worldwide perspective, this Tuesday, 5 November 2024, is an historical moment as a result of the American election can shape the political and economical equilibrium in the world. So therefore, in this context of uncertainty, we need more than ever to share common vision, both legal and political, on European integration. And in that perspective, a special attention has to be paid to the ongoing transformation of European economy and to the need to develop and to strengthen strong infrastructure within and between the member states. So this preliminary consideration lead me to the subject matter of my conference, which is about Europe's Europe highway regulation and the Green Deal, sustainability, infrastructure, and state aid. Let me first begin, as we have a mix of practitioner and student, with a first part. As we know, French colleague, we would like to be divided our presentation about the state of the law, the state of the situation, both from data and regulatory perspective. If we start first by the Green Deal, we must have in mind first that what we call Green Deal has been conceived as a very broad and encompassing strategy, a political strategy from the European Commission. Here is the formal or the official presentation by the Commission of the Green Deal, which has been done in its website 5 years ago. And as we can see, the Green Deal is global, mainstream, encompassing, as it covers several sub-branches of EU law: energy, taxation, transportation, environment, dimension obviously of land and forest. So the Green Deal, how can I say, is an issue about the mix of several political branches of EU law, the mix of several political sectors of EU law, in the sense that through the Green Deal, we mix several legal bases: the legal basis of energy in primary law, 194, the legal basis of transport, the legal basis of environment, network, and cohesion policy. So therefore, there is a need of consistency of how to mix these legal bases that overlap. We have technical issues, sorry, that overlap within the Green Deal. And that can be seen as a form of new regulatory process. And it also raises, as Thomas wrote it in an interesting paper for the European Stated Law Quarterly, issues about the stated. Within this broad picture of the Green Deal and this several dimension and sub-dimension, there is a need to take into consideration transport. Transport, because the smart and green mobility, or sustainable and smart mobility, is a key component of the Green Deal. We have a specific political strategy on that, which is called Sustainable and Smart Mobility Strategy, which has been launched in 2020 by the Commission. And this strategy aims to tackle the issue of emission of greenhouse gas by transport, because we can consider that around 23.2% of the total greenhouse gas emission comes from the transport, aviation, transport, road, and so on. And within this general data of GHG emission, the road and the plane are a key dimension of the emission of greenhouse gas, whereas rail activity are very low in terms of emission of greenhouse gas. So giving this data, the will of the Commission 4 years ago was to strengthen the part of the rail dimension for transport, both for freight, by increasing by 50% in 2030 and the double in 2050 the share of the freight, and also by increasing the part of high-speed rail traffic that should be doubled by 2030 and to be tripled by 2050. So we have very ambitious goal to increase the share and the part of the train as a component of this smart mobility strategy, which is itself a component of the Green Deal. So that's the first dimension of the picture. The other dimension of the picture is about railway. It's about railway, as you might know, or you shall know, that the EU has launched for now 1 decade or more than a decade, a process of opening up to competition rail and to favor the possibility for new railway undertaking to enter into the market and to compete with incumbent operator. Nevertheless, this process of opening up to competition of rail is a twofold process. It's a twofold process as it covers 2 dimensions that has to be legally and clearly distinguished. On the one hand, this process of opening up to competition covers what we call open access to the market, a right of access, a free access to the market. This process of open access to the market rely to the possibility for any railway undertaking to have access to train pass freely, to have a contract with the infrastructure manager, and to access in a non-discriminatory, fair, transparent conditions to the infrastructure and to propose train services for passengers. In this scheme, we do not have any public service contract. Neither we don't have any public service obligation requirement. On the other hand, this process of opening up to competition also refers to another phase, another reality, which is what we call PSO competition, or competition for public service obligation, which is covered by another regulation, which is very important for our topic, which is a regulation called PSO, Public Service Obligation Regulation, Regulation 3070/2007, which deal with competition for awarding public services contract, meaning a situation where a public authority could be the city of the region of Vienne or Région Île-de-France in Paris, but requirement of public service to award public service obligation contract. Here, it's more an issue of tendering and to tender public procurement contract or concession contract. And with the fourth railway package 10 years ago, or less than 10 years ago, we do have now an obligation for member states to open up to competition this award of PSO contract. If we follow with this issue, we can observe that in several member states, these two dimensions are observed or are implemented, but in a very diverse way. If we take the case of open access to the market, we do have free access for what we call TGV, high-speed line. This is free access to the market. And we have now new competitors, Trenitalia or Renfe, that compete within the French market. And here in Austria, you have the case of Westbahn. As far as I know, Westbahn make free access to the market, open access to the market, and it gave rise to a ruling called Westbahn in 2019 about the relationship between Westbahn and ÖBB infrastructure about access to the network. On the other side, if we have a look at the PSO contract, it's another reality. In France, it's very gradual. We open very gradually the award of public contract for local train, what we call trains express régionaux, but it's very progressive. And in Austria, as far as I know, we had a modification of the law to permit to allow this competitive tendering. But I'm not sure, but maybe we can discuss after that we have really competitive tendering for PSO contract, but maybe we will discuss here and the relationship with open access. So this twofold dimension has also to be put into perspective with the reality between member states, as we can observe that we have a huge heterogeneity of practice between member states. If you have a look at the scheme here on the right, we can observe that in some member states, all the rail traffic is under PSO. For instance, Denmark or Luxembourg or Netherlands, most of the traffic or all the traffic is under the PSO scheme. So it's more an issue of tendering PSO contract. Whereas we have other countries, Austria, France, where we have a mix between PSO and commercial, which is open access, like TGV, high-speed line, which is on the first side of the access. So this figure, and I will switch to the third point of my first part, raises an issue of finance. Raises an issue of finance because obviously, if we have a look of this data, and if we have a look also of this political objective to increase the share of freight and to increase the share of rail in the framework of the Green Deal, obviously we have requirement of financing and requirement of state aid. Here, the amounts are very high. In the mobility strategy document of the Commission of last year, which applied for the year 2021, we do observe that we have a total amount of 41.8 billion euro for the total infrastructure expenditure in Europe, which is very high. And this total amount of expenditure share between, on the other hand, infrastructure as itself, the use of the infrastructure, the financing of the infrastructure, the finance of the track, and on the other hand, a huge part of the amount is about PSO compensation, how to compensate the contract and the economic equilibrium of the contract. And yet again, it's very interesting to show that we do observe a very huge diversity of practice between member states. If you look here, for instance, for Austria, and you have a look of the cost per inhabitant each year of investment in the rail, you have 2/3 about infrastructure, 1/3 about PSO. It's like the same in France, but with a weak investment on rail, whereas in other countries, for instance, in Hungary, you have a major investment of PSO, less in infrastructure. So we have a very fragmented way of funding rail between member states. So regarding this state of the finance and regarding the state of the network, we have to consider and to think about how to mobilize stated law, how to consider tools to finance this need of financing infrastructure and the development of infrastructure. And the idea I would like to defend here, the main point I would like to defend, is, in my impression, we have now about rail infrastructure in general and state aid, a very fragmented landscape, a form of kaleidoscope of ground, of funding, of leverage, of funding. To present this, I come back with a quite famous painter of Austrian, Klimt, in French, which is Arbre de la Vie, or Stockler Fritz, where we can see that when we start about how to fund, we have several branches that can be mobilized to consider the funding of the network. We can fund the network or part of the contract by PSO regulation. We have a new exemption regulation. I'm going to go into in deep on that. We have the regulation de minimis, which can be used, but not so given the amount of the infrastructure. We have also the regulation on common project of interest, which is also very recent. We have also new project of guideline on state aid for land and multimodal transport. So we have a form of kaleidoscope of fragmented way, and that create a form of complexity to choose and to see whether we can use a branch or another branch to fund the network and to fund the development of rail in a member state and between member states. So if I go more in deep in this presentation, maybe I can make another look of these several leverages, tools. First, if we consider specific stated transport or targeted stated scheme for highway. To understand the topic, we have to go back to the primary law, which is relevant at stake. And we have to recall that the relevant ground in primary law for transport is not Article 107, but it's Article 93 of the TFU. It's Article 93 of the TFU, which is the form of lex specialis in the framework of stated law. And Article 93 TFU as a lex specialis says that aids shall be compatible with the treaty if they meet the need of coordination of transport and if they represent reimbursement for the discharge of certain obligations inherent in the concept of a public service. Many things has been written about this ground. First, because it is the only ground where we have this concept of public service and not SGEI and not services of general economic interest. Also because we have some old cases about what do we need by the coordination of transport, what this concept of coordination of transport do cover. But in practice for now 20 or 30 years, this lex specialis is used as a ground to enact specific rules of stated applying to transport and more specifically to railway and to infrastructure of transport. The first expression of this implementation has been used 15 years ago with specific guideline on stated for railway undertaking, guidelines that has been endorsed in 2008 by the Commission. And this guideline did identify at that time specific funding support, specific scheme support for the rolling stock, both to buy rolling stock or to purchase rolling stock, or to have all the rolling stock to use. It has also been used to make a restructuration for railway undertaking or to consider debt cancellation for railway undertaking. This guideline has been so endorsed 15 years ago, but their implementation and their consistency with the need of changing funding support for infrastructure has not been so significant. And if we have a look at the database of stated, we only see few cases of implementation of these guidelines. I saw in the database, but maybe I am mistaken, 2 cases, but maybe I am mistaken with Austria, one for rail freight services in certain segments in 2022, and another one also for freight services in the context of the rolling height-way, which is a sectoral implementation of the guidelines of 2008. And from France, unless we have a deep involvement on rail, we have few cases of implementation of this guideline. The main one is the construction of a line between Charles de Gaulle Airport and the center of Paris. So it's quite weak and limited given the importance of the political importance of this guideline. So therefore, these guidelines has been assessed. We had what we call a fitness check of the stated on generally the stated package and more specifically the railway guideline. And there was also a need to give more consistency to this guideline given this context of opening up to competition and also to have in mind the barrier to enter to the market for new undertaking operator. So therefore, given this stage and given this limit, the framework has recently changed in several dimensions. First, 2 years ago, in December 2022, we did have a specific regulation on the exemption for specific of transport. We know that in stated law, we have what we call the block exemption regulation of 2014. But in transport, for now 2 years, we do have a form of lex specialis in the framework of transport, which is the regulation 22-25-86, which has been endorsed on the ground of 93, 107, and 108, which aim at identifying specific block exemption, specifically target for transport and rail. So it's a form of lex specialis in the landscape of the ground of exemption regulation. And on the ground of this regulation of 2022, we have now two proposals, which are pending proposals because they have been presented last June by the Commission. So they are under discussion. On the one hand, we do have a new specific TBER. TBER is for Transport Block Exemption Regulation, which aim at declaring certain category of rail that could be compatible with the internal market, with a mechanism of exemption of notification, with also identification of threshold and a diversity of type of support. This TBER would, I said would because it's still a proposal, would apply for general scheme of funding. So this TBER would coexist with new guidelines, which are called draft guidelines on stated and land and multimodal transport, also presented in last June and which are under discussion. And this guideline would apply not for general scheme, but better for ad hoc measure, specific measure targets to finance rolling stock or network or multimodal activity. And also this guideline apply what we call the traditional criteria of exemption in the stated aid, which are the incentive effect, the necessity of the measure, the appropriateness of the measure, the intensity, the proportionality. I will detail in a minute. So we would have a form of twofold legal framework, if this framework is endorsed, but I think it would be, to specific targets stated regarding railway and the funding. If we go more in deep about these twofold new legal frameworks that would be endorsed, we can observe that on the other hand, for the exemptions for TBER for transport activity, the scope of this regulation on exemption would be quite wide, as it would apply to stated to reduce external costs, also to scheme to launch new commercial connection, also to investment scheme for construction and renewal of rail or inland waterway. But it would also apply to the investment aid for private seeking, or also acquisition of a vehicle. So we have a very wide scope, which is not only covering rail, but all forms of transport that are green, intermodal, and that need funding to be intermodal and to increase the use of green transportation. On the other hand, if we have a look at the guidelines, the interesting point is that the new guidelines which are under proposal are still shaped, I would say, in the classical way of the stated law, as they focus on the criteria of necessity, and the criteria of necessity refer to existence of a market failure. Do we have a market failure? And can we prove that the market would then be able to shift to a sustainable form of land transport or to shift to rail? And this concept of market failure, which is very traditional in EU economic law, refers to existence of price disparity or difficulty which are faced by market operator, or problem of coordination failure between markets. So we have this criteria, very classical, of necessity. In French, we say test de nécessité. And the appropriateness, in French, test d'aptitude, appropriateness, which has to see that the funding has to be demonstrated as is the less distortive policy instrument, and the funding which could be developed by member state are less distortive from an instrument such as guarantee or a mechanism of loan, which could be less distortive as grants. So if we sum up with this idea, the point that can be stressed, taken, is about the somehow complexity of this twofold mechanism, new TBER, new guidelines. Because if we have a look of the annex of the legal framework, we can observe that we have still, I'm going right now into detail, a methodology to consider stated about the intensity of the measure, about the type of aid, about the identification of eligible cost, and this methodology differ regarding the type of aid we would consider under this new twofold regulation, whether it is about to reduce external cost, whether it is about to launch new commercial connection, or whether it is about to make construction or to upgrade unimodal or multimodal rail or transport facility, or is about to renew our private seating. So the methodology differ regarding the target in terms of cost, in terms of intensity, in terms of eligibility of the cost. So that's the first idea I would like to share with you. That's this idea that we do observe a form of ad hoc, lex specialis legal framework for stated law, for railway and for transport. But that's not all, and that's referred to the Klimt painting I give you. If you give the tree, we have also other supports, and now go straight to another type of support, which is not formally stated, which is network policy. Network policy is not very well known by very often practitioners, or many practitioners by the students, but it's really an interesting topic. We do have in primary law a specific legal ground called network policy, in French, politique des réseaux, Article 170, 172 of the TFEU. And this network policy is used to enact specific rules on network between member states. This concept of network policy is based on the key concept of PIC, project of common interest. A member state has to demonstrate, has to propose a project of common interest within a network, including the creation of a network, the creation of an infrastructure, a new intermodality structure or building, well, any project that could be covered within an infrastructure. This concept of network policy is based on the definition of a network by the EU itself, and we do have now, the first regulation on that, Regulation 1315/2013, a mapping of the network, and through this mapping of the network, we do have a distinction between what we call core network, extended core network, and potential core network, which is a mapping of the infrastructure within and between member states. The case law on the network policy is not very well established, or is, I would say, of the beginning, but we should insist on the fact that the way we think as a lawyer on network policy is a little bit different than the way we think in the ground of state aid, because it's not the same legal policy, it's not the same way of functioning. We have a case on energy on that, which is a case Aquint of the General Court, which is quite recent, February 2023, where the court about a network of energy ruled that in the framework of the Trans-European Network Policy, there is, on the one hand, a leeway of the European Union to define network and connection between member states, but also, the General Court say, a form of right of veto in favor of the member state because the identification of network includes territorial aspect and in some way touches upon town and country planning, which are areas that traditionally fall within the sovereignty of the member state. So network is quite complex. It's a shared competence regarding the distribution of competence. And this legal reasoning of the court show that we can have a form of blockage, of veto, of control by member state to define which type of network should be under the network or should not be under the network to be financed by the EU. And regarding this issue of funding, we have also to stress that here we are outside the traditional concept of state aid because the funding of this network, they refer not to state aid, they refer to specific tools such as a tool which is Connecting Europe Facility, which is a form of either loan, either subvention to specific project, la Facilité pour la Connexion, Connecting Europe Facility. It is also funded by the InvestEU program, and it can be also be financed by the New Generation program through the Recovery and Resilience Facility, and that connect with the European semester and the big project that member state can present to the European Commission. So we have specific grant and funding. The interesting point for our topic about this network policy is the fact that the new regulation we have in June, we have this new regulation 24/16/79, 30 June 2024, so it's very new. This new regulation is very precise and very, I would say, far-reaching to define connections between member states. Here is the annex of the regulation, this map in the annex of the regulation of 30 June 2024. And we can observe here in the annex that we have now in the regulation a mapping of high-speed line between member states. Here in blue, you have the existing high-speed line in the country. And in the dashed line or the fragmented line, you have the line that should be built by member state by 2030 or at least by 2050, here between France and Spain, or here in Austria, in the western part of Austria, or even between Austria and Romania and Hungary. So the program is very ambitious, is very far-reaching, and it tackles the issue of this leeway of the member state, of the consistency with this ruling. Do we have or no veto, or can we consider that the harmonization is now very far and more precise through this competence of network? And it has also to do with a European mapping of infrastructure between member states, both for height line in blue, but also for conventional line in green that should be modified, rebuilt, or subject to renewable infrastructure. So this is a second part of the idea, the second branch of the funding. But it's not finished. If not finished, if we go back to my tree, we have the state aid on infrastructure, we have the regulation on network policy, but there is also another ground of funding for infrastructure and developing rail, which is still different, which is the concept of compensation of public service. And that's another issue. It has to see with regulation on PSO, Regulation 3070/2007, we can speak a lot about this regulation, which is very central in the practice of transports. But a key dimension of this regulation is the fact that this regulation, in a way, has codified Altmark case law. This regulation has codified Altmark case law, which is about the theory of compensation of public service. And the regulation says that we have public fund in a public contract that are used to cover public service obligation in the concession contract. These funding are not stated, but are compensation of public services in the meaning of the Altmark ruling. It's a codification of Altmark. And this codification of the Altmark ruling raises a specific body of legal issue and cases for the Court of Justice regarding the control of overcompensation. Do we have a proper finance to the content of PSO, or do we have an overcompensation that go beyond the content? We have also issue about the identification of PSO, the proportionality, the scope of the PSO, and we have very cases. We have a substantial body of case law on that, where the courts, on the one hand, insist on the freedom, the leeway of a public authority to define PSO, the compensation, the clauses in the contract to define PSO and the finance dimension. And on the other way, we have also these guidelines of saying PSO has to be strict, we have to prove market failure, we have to be precise in drafting the contract. So it's a matter of equilibrium, this issue of PSO. But it's also an important ground to consider funding of freight, because if you impose PSO for a passenger, in the new regulation, the proposal, there is also a project of considering PSO for freight, also PSO for freight. We do have connection on how we draft the concession contract, how he has to be consistent with the general economic equilibrium, and also how he has to be consistent with public procurement law and the directive on concession. So that's another side of the dimension, but that's very important because I'm deeply convinced that we need PSO targeted by public authority to force specific obligations to shift to rail or to shift to green transported, because the market solely is not able to make this transformation. So that raises the issue of PSO. Last point of this second part is, as if we consider this broader perspective of funding, so we have stated, we have network, we have PSO, is the funding of the network by rail charges. That's another way of considering the issue. By rail charges, I consider the charges, in French we say péage ferroviaire, the charges that has to be paid by a railway undertaking to the infrastructure manager to use the infrastructure, railway charges. This issue is also very important in EU law. We have a specific body of law on that, which is a directive on railway, Directive 2012 34, which say that the way we determine the charges to go into the network, the rail charges, has to be calculated regarding the cost that is directly incurred by the operating train services, the cost that is directly incurred by the operating cost services. In French, we say le coût directement imputable. We have a very also substantial body of cases from the court of how to define and how to consider and how to give a definition of that concept. How can we define this concept of cost that is directly incurred? It is not a marginal cost. We have a leeway for the infrastructure manager, and we did have legal challenge, especially in Germany, a case Deutsche Bahn Station Service AG, but also more recently also in Germany, the Länderbad GmbH, about the methodology that has to be followed by the infrastructure manager. So Dutch Bahn nets, but could be also OBB infrastructure or SNCF réseau in France, to define the way they make a calculation of the cost, and that charges they are used for the network, for the improvement of the network, for building the network, for the use of the network. We have also a pending case, but we don't have the conclusion of the Advocate General for Austria, a case OBB infrastructure against Westbahn management, which also raises this question of how to consider the calculation of this cost of railway. This point is very important because around 40% of the cost of the infrastructure is covered by these charges, by these rate charges. If you take the train, if we take, for instance, the train between Paris and Lyon, we take the high-speed line, TGV, around 30 and 40% of the price is about the charges, to finance the infrastructure. So it's an important dimension to finance the infrastructure and to switch to green mobility. But on the other side, given this wording of the text, given this ruling, we do observe a very diverse practice of methodology to determine the way we consider this calculation. I mean, the methodology of OBB infrastructure is not the same that of SNCF réseau, is not the same that Trenitalia or Renfe in Spain, and we have a huge diversity of methodology between member states. And that's a major issue in a medium term, if we consider that the rate charges should be a major component of funding the network and funding the performance of the network. It's a pending and major issue in this legal and general landscape. So given all these dimensions and given all these leverages of funding that I present, I switch to my last point, which is the consistency of all this framework, of all these dimensions. About the consistency, I would focus on 2 or 3 main points. First is about the qualification of status as itself. In the guideline about stated on railway that has been endorsed in 2008, but also in the practice of the European Commission, there is this idea that the legal qualification of status as itself is excluded, has to be excluded when the construction of an infrastructure is subject to a legal monopoly, and where within this infrastructure we have an access on a competitive, transparent, non-discriminatory, and unconditional tendering procedure to access and to use the infrastructure. It's a legal exclusion of the qualification of stated, which has been done in many cases from the Commission and by the court in a case on the airport of Leipzig-Halle. A pending case, and we do not have clear answer on that, is whether this position is still relevant because the new guideline I present, the new exemption regulation I present, does not really tackle or consider this case law and this practice from the Commission and put into the general mechanism of stated as refined by the guideline the funding of the network. So it's a pending issue. Personally, I would argue that we should maintain this point. We should maintain this point that whether you fund an infrastructure for OBB or SNCF réseau, and if such infrastructure is widely open in a competitive way to everybody, then the legal qualification of stated should not be so relevant because it's not really an economic advantage. It's a public funding to develop economic activity in a wide way on a given infrastructure. So there is a need of consistency regarding this. Second issue that should be raised regarding this framework is about the stage of the competition in railway. An important point on that is the fact that if you see at OBB in Austria, Dutch Bahn, SNCF, Trenitalia or Ferrovie dello Stato in Spain, all these companies, they are what we call vertically integrated railway undertaking. Vertically integrated railway undertaking, meaning that within the same body, we have on the one hand the network activity, OBB infrastructure, SNCF réseau. On the other hand, we have the transport activity, SNCF Voyageurs, for instance, in France. And these two activities has to be clearly separated from both the account, the transparency, and the activity. Given this fact, given the fact also that member states would not change this system because they are political, at least strategic, to maintain this big undertaking in some member states. There are obviously issue of cross subsidies, transparency between this new scheme of funding I present and the vertically integrated railway undertaking and the branch of passenger or freight. So we likely observe in the coming years legal issue cases regarding how all these funds are present should be not fully affect in cross subsidization in this very integrated railway undertaking. Very last point, avant-dernier point, on all this picture of stated law. No, here it's more the repetition. I would argue on that. Is maybe whether when we have a look at all this landscape, we can wonder whether we are not at the beginning of a form of a paradigm shift or a form of huge change in the legal landscape about funding and network. If you have a look at two main reports we have about European economy recently, Rapport l'État, which is much more than a market in last April, more recently December, Draghi report, the future of European competitiveness. The two political reports, l'État and Draghi, stresses on the point that to be consistent and to assume EU sovereignty, EU strategic autonomy, EU industrial policy ambition, we need to rely, or we should rely, that the content of the reports, to EPCE, so to this common project in the field of network. Rapport l'État say EPCE network should be served as a model, as a blueprint to impulse transformation in the European economy, and not so to stated classically understood. And in the Draghi report, there is also this stress on the fact that the aid intensity in EU is less than in the US regarding the Biden program, because we have a funding of around 20%, a huge complexity, procedural complexity. And given that point, Draghi report stresses on the fact that we should deploy to revamp a tool, to modify tool, which is also a mechanism of common project interest combining with stated, and also a mechanism of competitiveness joint undertaking between member states. So this report also stresses on a form of limitation or a non-consistency of the classical model of stated to cope with the issue of infrastructure, of funding, of assuming the objective of the Green Deal. So this analysis, together with this very diverse landscape I present, lead us, and that will be my final consideration, lead us to think about the legal boundary in EU primary law. In the presentation I made, I use both stated law 107, 108. I use also this competence of network policy 170. There is also this competence about industry, which is an ancillary competence or supporting competence, which is not very clear in terms of implementation, which is saying that the EU should improve industry and should foster industry and infrastructure between member states. So a pending issue is to see whether all these boundaries are still relevant, whether they are blurred or they are not blurred, and whether we should consider in the coming year a more consistent ground about investments, supporting infrastructure, supporting development in primary law in order to avoid this diversity of landscape and the huge complexity of funding scheme I have presented today. So we can see regarding all this presentation that we are at the beginning of a form of crossroad about EU economic law, a crossroad about the legal boundary, a crossroad about the articulation between state aid law and sectoral and material policy. And I was very glad to share with you today in Vienna this consideration. And I thank you very much for your attention. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, cher Stéphane, pour ta conférence très intense, intéressant. We're privileged to have had you. Before, while you think of questions, I'm starting the discussion in a second. I forgot in the introduction that you're also president of File France. And I apologize for that, but I mention it here because I would like to advertise, not just the national associations, but also the Austrian Association, which has a special deal for young members under the age of 30, only 10 euros, and you get a great deal for that. So check out our website either, Österreichische Gesellschaft für Europarecht. And we also have some membership forms down at the Institute. So I apologize to the president of the French Association and invite you to join the Austrian Association. Are there questions that you have ready? Otherwise, I'll maybe break the ice with a question of my own. Then I will start while you think of questions. Actually, I found very interesting your point on the closing point on the Draghi and the letter reports on the question where we headed with state aid. And I very much share your point. And actually, at the conference that I gave a presentation at 2 weeks ago, I made the same point. I think we are in a paradigm shift in state aid where we need to consider why we are controlling state aid and in what areas and for what purpose. And indeed, we have seen with the Next Generation EU program, and the Commission itself calls it that a European Marshall Plan. So a big investment program for purposes that the EU shares and wants to promote the Green Deal and interconnectivity and so forth. And I have one observation, one question in that regard. The observation is that we're still in a half-hearted approach because now we have those investment programs that are paid for to a large amount by EU programs, but that are still, although a little bit under Commission control, in the hands of the member states. And I think that is half-hearted because if the EU is paying for it, eventually maybe the member states are paying for it, but immediately the EU is paying for it, so it should also have more control over where the money goes. Do you, and so that's my observation, I think we need a new, this is awkward, we need a new Marshall, a more ambitious Marshall Plan or Next Generation Program. The question is, do you think that given that we have Next Generation EU and we might see a prolongation of that program, that we need therefore to reduce the volumes of state aid in other areas? Like, for example, if we talk about projects in the infrastructure area in railway, does that not mean that in other areas, national state aid should be reduced, for example, for transport in railway? Why do we need subsidization for the activities? If the infrastructure is there, the infrastructure is then probably a lot cheaper than it is now. Does that not mean that correspondingly we should reduce other areas where member states are at the moment still free to hand out state aid?
Thank you. Thank you, Thomas. Very good, interesting question and very, very relevant. If I go back here, I share your opinion regarding that we are at the beginning of a paradigm shift. Because if we have a look at network policy, for instance, or if you have a look at the specific funding, this leverage are used for goals that used to be assumed by state. 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago, we have launched this process of modernization of state aid. And the process of modernization of state aid that had been launched 15 years ago around was to use state aid regarding economical, political, sustainable goals. But what we observe, and it is written in the Letta report or in the Draghi report, is the fact that this mechanism of modernization of state aid has worked, but not fully, is not fully consistent with the objective. Because it's very complex in terms of implementation, because we do observe a share of responsibility between the European Commission and member states, which are in the front line for their own state aid, and because the process of award is much more longer than the mechanism of funding we have in the US. So we do observe this skip through new ground network, for instance, or specific targeted with charges for the infrastructure, which are built on another rationale than stated, which are built on another legal rationale than stated, without this ex-ante control of compatibility with internal markets, and which are more focused on the construction of infrastructure without having in mind the distortive competitive effects that we could observe with the glance of state aid. So in my opinion, that's my opinion, I would consider that we should keep state aid for classical and restrictive competitive issues. For instance, you have the case, for instance, Ryanair, we have the airplanes. We do have reduction of fees for airports to attract Ryanair to open 9. That's obviously state aid, and they have to be covered by state aid because it creates an advantage regarding Ryanair for another company. That could be classical, an issue of state aid. But regarding using public fund for public objective, public goals of changing infrastructure, modernizing, switch to green infrastructure, I'm not sure that state aid are still relevant. I'm not sure that's still relevant. If you have a look at what I present, it's still quite complex, this new mechanism we have of two legal ground and eligibility of cost and so on, and which should maybe, and that's the meaning of the Draghi report, more stress on this network competence and having a more global vision of how to fund through EU law public infrastructure. But that raises another issue, which is an issue which is still unsolved, of distribution of competence between the EU and member state, because member state logically needs to keep a control on their own infrastructure and their own political choice about their territory. So there is a legal need to think and to consider legally what we can put inside this network competence, which is, in my opinion, at the beginning of its development and at the beginning of its legal consistency.
That allows me, if I may, to add another question, but I see already Martin Meisel from the Austrian Foreign Ministry with a question. Maybe I'll let you go first and then.
Thank you, and thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting to see this multifaceted approach to one topic. Definitely it's bold thinking and a bold approach on the European level. My question is it bold enough? When you showed us the map with the 10 network,
the map?
Yes, then you stumble across a couple of holes in the network. Southern Eastern Europe, the Balkans, we just draw the lines around it. Switzerland is just a blank spot in between. As Europeans, can we afford to take Europe so literally to restrict ourselves to EU territories when we think about transport and traffic.
If I have understood well, and if I am not mistaken, you mean, can we consider that EU has a sufficient competence to map this or to define this network?
Sorry, shouldn't Europe think a little bit bigger?
Bigger.
Now, if you take the line, if you start in Greece and you want to go to Vienna, you don't follow the line. You follow the territory of EU member states. Is this the best option? Is this the most sustainable option? Also considering that all these countries are accession countries, and that we should think about transport and rail, not about boundaries and states.
I'm not. Well, this map is the official annex of the regulation. So if you have a look at the regulation, this one, 2024-1679, this is the official annex, one of the official annex, because we have also official annex on freight, on harbor, port, a connection between harbor and so on. So as a legal act of the EU, it reflects the current stage of member states, and that's true about acceding country or potential acceding country. It refers to pre-adhesion tools, to tool of accession, pre-existing tools of funding between member states. But an important point of the regulation on network, I could have stressed this, and thank you for giving me the opportunity, is the fact that beside this official landscape, we do have also the potential funding, which is, they call this potential core network, because you have the core network, the extended core, and the potential core network. And in the potential core network, réseau potentiel, they also include Ukraine, Moldavia, and part of the former Yugoslavia. But they cut in the regulation, they clearly cut, if you have a look at the regulation, any connection with Belarus and Russia. So it's a political mapping. It's a political mapping that will be depend of how we give or not consistency to the potential core network, which is also mapped, but not in this document. I don't know whether if I answer to your question.
There are more questions. I would collect one or two or three questions. Are there more? Three questions for one round of answers, if I may? And then we'll wrap this up.
As you want.
Thanks for your input on this very complex topic. I'm working for the Chamber of Labor, focused on railway policies. So it's very interesting to hear about the block exemption and the guidelines for land and multimodal transport. I'm interested because we did the first review and we were a bit surprised by all the limitations, especially to the block exemptions. The financial limits are pretty low on one hand. And on the other hand, it's pretty bureaucratic how the funding should be notified. So do you see a legal basis in connection with the Green Deal, where the modal shift in favor of rail is set? But then on the other hand, there are guidelines and block exemption actually limiting a modal shift in the favor of rail. So this is kind of contradicting in our Austrian view. So do you see a legal basis where we can address the Commission how these guidelines can be revised? I mean, they're at the proposal stage now, but if it's...
You mean what is the legal ground of the guideline? That's the question?
Not the legal ground of the guideline, but if you have a goal to reach to get more freight on rail, and then you have a regulation which actually favors a shift to the road because it's cheaper, because we have a market failure, and the guidelines are not correcting it. So what is there a legal basis to address actually a failure of goal achievement?
I see. Okay. Okay. Ariane, je réponds?
Well, I was going to connect, but why don't
Okay,
you?
so I can answer directly. I mean, I totally share this impression of bureaucratic tool. That's true. If you have a look at this annex, we can see that both in terms of eligibility, of cost, of proportionality, also of amount, because we have this limitation of threshold of 10 million or 20 million in the new transport block exemption regulation. So it's quite complex and not fully consistent with this need of green transformation. But more fundamentally, more essentially, I would argue that this concept of market failure, which is at the very heart of the state aid law and which underpins the general legal regime of state aid law, even also in the guidelines we have of PSO regulation, this concept of market failure is not fully relevant to tackle the issue of the green transformation. That's my opinion. So it's not a legal base to challenge the guideline, because the guidelines legally, they are funded in Article 93 of the TFU. It's a lex specialis on transport. But it will be a reluctance about the legal implementation and the legal interpretation of the guidelines. To avoid the use of funding to road, or to avoid that funding can be go to road because it's less costly or it's more appropriate, we need to relax in the case law in the way we think legally, I would say classical concept of economic law. Market failure, appropriateness of the measure, necessity of the measure. All these concepts, they are really on the ground of economic law. But my opinion is that they have to be relaxed. They have to be relaxed, a little bit put aside, because they are not targets and shape to tackle this issue. You cannot consider funding of rail by comparing, what could be a market regarding transport or car to compare with rail. It's not fully consistent. So maybe how to do this? Maybe by integrating in the legal reasoning of market failure, general ground of interest, overriding reason of general interest, raison impérieuse d'intérêt général, about environment, about energy, about circular economy, new reason of overriding region of general interest that would have to be balanced with this concept of market failure, and that would impede a broad vision of market failure. In my opinion, that could be the way to limit this effect of the guidelines.
One, two more questions, and then I'll slowly wrap this up. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor De La Rosa, for the presentation and the insights you gave us. And thanks especially for the PSO regulation that you mentioned. And I have a question in regard to that, because
Regarding
to the PSO regulation, yes. Because much about this regulation is about state aid, actually, and that was based on the fact that the regulation, basically in 2007, when it came into existence, was focused on the direct award of public passenger transport contracts. So there was no tendering at all. As a public authority, you could decide, I take this operator and I award the contract, and for that reason, there is a very complex, very short, but very complex annex to that regulation, which sets out what are the requirements in order to be state aid compliant. Good luck with that when you apply that in practice, because it's, I say, just quantifying network effects is a special thing for itself. Okay, since end of 2023, end of last year, the unconditional direct award of public contracts is gone. So there will be a shift in the direction of tendering these contracts. And usually on the stated law, basically it says if you have tendering, then, and you have more than one offer, or at least two offers or three, then there should be no state aid involved anymore, because there was a competitive process, and so you have not to worry anymore about having state aid. Will that really be the case? And if so, will there be, if in future these contracts are tendered, will there a shift away from state aid issues we had in the past, more in the direction of public procurement issues? Or what do you think? So will there be a shift in focus in that regard?
Thank you very much. Well, on this issue, in my opinion, there are two interconnected issues, two related issues. The first issue is about the process of awarding the contract, awarding through tendering the contract. And this issue of awarding the contract is related to public procurement law and concession law, because we have a form of legal articulation between PSO regulation, the concession directive, Directive 2014-23, and the Public Procurement Directive. And all these legal norms interact about awarding the contract. Regarding the fact, you're right, that now for 2 years, we need to tender PSO contract. We would have, in most member states, a tender process that mix general law on public procurement, both concession and public procurement, including element of specificities that are in the PSO contract for drafting the clauses or considering the duration of the contract or the general economic equilibrium of the contract. So that's one issue, which is at the very beginning. For instance, in France, we have now 2 lines that have been tendering awarded, but we are at the very, very beginning. And if we consider member states where, I go back here, where all the network is under PSO, like Netherlands or Belgium, for instance, we have a very strong reluctance, and we can understand politically this reluctance to open PSO, because that would mean that all the network is open in this country. So that's the first issue. The second issue, which is related but a little bit different, is about the economic equilibrium of the contract, which are most of the time concession contract in the meaning of EU law. It's not easy to understand, because when PSO contract was endorsed in 2007, it has been portrayed and considered as a codification of Altmark. And Altmark is not about state aid. Altmark is about the theory of compensation, which did not lead to notify the funding, because you compensate. So in a way, you displace the issue to a classical issue of state aid to an issue of overcompensation and general economic equilibrium of the contract. So that's still true, but in my opinion, on that way, issues are more complex than in 2007, because we have this need to shift to rail, because we have greener issue in using rail, because public authority began to understand that can use, or they should use PSO as a leverage to impose green targets or facilities for disabled people or any tariff obligation. And given this political and growing political use of the PSO, the counterpart is about the calculation of the economic equilibrium and how to make Altmark without going to overcompensation. That, in my opinion, the main issue. Maybe we should modify PSO regulation to be more precise on that. We have the guidelines on PSO regulation that have been modified last year, but these guidelines, and in line with what I said, are not still satisfactory, because they're still focused on market failure. And in my opinion, I'm not sure that we should focus on market failure to define PSO as we have in the guideline. And more broadly, that has also maybe to see with the modification of public procurement contract, because all these PSO contracts for rail are long-term contract. When we award the concession of rail, it's about 10 years or 15 years. That's not a basic concession contract, because you have a huge investment for the rolling stock, for using all the machinery. And we should maybe be more aware about how we can consider, regarding EU law, clauses in the contract to modify the economic equilibrium and to consider an evolution in the time, in the duration of the compensation. So that's more the main issue, in my opinion, rather than classical issue of state aid.
Thank you. We're running out of time. One very last brief question and a brief answer, please.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. Maybe just adding up to this like complexity of the tree of Klimt. How do you think this state aid of EU regarding the infrastructure or let's say railway systems may interact with the subsidies regime of WTO? Because it seems to me that like they target this like specific sector of railway or infrastructure. So do you think they may qualify as a prohibited subsidies? Thank you.
Very quick, I'm not fully aware or specialized in WTO, but I would argue that to avoid any interference with WTO, we should consider that all this funding are not to be considered always as stated, so therefore that should not fall under the concept of subsidies under PSO. So that refers to the case law I present on airport Leipzig Hall. The court said when you have funding for infrastructure which is after widely open to competition, we should not consider that as a state aid law. So we should be consistent with this position in order to avoid the legal qualification of state aid and therefore to have this consistency with the WTO. Secondly, and so very quickly, we have also an issue about subsidies, but I would say also regarding foreign subsidies, because the most prominent and the most current dimension we observe now is about foreign undertaking, foreign from Europe, third country undertaking from China, for instance, that apply to have a contract for infrastructure or for concession contract. And that interferes with the foreign subsidies regulation that had been endorsed last year about how to consider a specificity of treatment for third country bidder or third country operator, given the strategic use of infrastructure of Europe. And we have a very recent case of the Court of Justice, which has been rendered 2 weeks ago, case Fernandez, I think, where the court formally said that in a public procurement contract, or in a concession contract, third countries, operator for third countries, like Turkey in that case, should not be treated in an equal way, in the same equal way that the European economic operator. So the court argued and did consider, that you may just say, we can be critical of the content of the case, that we can have two types of approach of the principle of equality, considering that a full principle of equality should not apply to a foreign third company that apply to infrastructure contract or highway concession contract. So we have at the beginning also a big change about subsidies, foreign subsidies on this case of infrastructure.
Merci beaucoup. On peut voir que c'est une matière très proche de ta cœur. Oui. Et on est très privilégié. Merci d'avoir venu.
Merci Thomas. Merci.
Et aussi, merci pour la présentation très compétente, très intensive. Merci beaucoup. Thank you everyone for coming. And until next time, the next Werkstattgespräch is in December, January, December. 12th of December, so please come again. Thank you. I have a small gift. That's the word. A gift. I don't know. Did you come by railway?
Huh?
Did you come by train?
No.
Okay.
So no, I have.
You have to fly with me. So are you drinking this one?
Oh, okay.
Oh yeah, actually, by the way.